So we do see here in our gospel passage several questions. And this interaction between Jesus and a Samaritan woman. And there is this stark contrast from last week's passage where we had Jesus dialoguing with Nicodemus, a very well-known, educated leader in the community, in the cloak of night. And yet today we find ourselves at high noon when folks would not have gone to the watering well with the heat. We find this woman who is unnamed, a foreigner who we hear in the passage, Jews and Samaritans would not have interacted. A man and a woman at the well, that is not of proper etiquette, so to speak. And so we're in this very different context. And we have this dialogue. Nicodemus's dialogue last week was about water and new birth and trying to understand how we can follow Jesus's way and think outside of the box creatively. And then here we have this yearning and this thirst from the well and the Samaritan of how do we get quenched with this thirst that we have for God? Tommy, would you like to start us off with one of our questions?
Yeah. So I was very struck in the language here of Jews and Samaritans not sharing things in common with our current context.
Yeah.
So in a global pandemic, there are many ways in which we quite rightly won't share things in common. So for instance, we're asked to keep social distance.
Right.
And not share forks and knives and spoons with each other, or not to get too close to one another.
Yeah.
So a virus is a contagion, and the closer we get to each other, the more likely it is that that contagion can cross space, and we can become infected, or infect someone else if we're carrying the virus.
Right.
So I think I'm very struck by this language in here. Who knows what the reasons, I mean, there were many political and social, cultural reasons why Jews and Samaritans didn't associate.
Sure.
I'm wondering about the ways in which we talk about us and them in our culture, especially in times of stress, and the contagion that exists when we are unable to reach across difference of culture or other difference because of fear.
Right.
And I'm wondering about this question where the Samaritan woman who comes into contact with Jesus at this well, as you said, in a way that's not entirely appropriate, not socially acceptable. And Jesus asks her for a drink.
Right.
And so she says, how is it that you ask a Samaritan woman like me for a drink? And I'm wondering, what is Jesus asking? What is this question in terms of Jesus' ministry mean for us today as we think about the social distancing that we're doing with one another because of a virus, but the concern of how do we stay together as a body?
Right. Yeah. I wonder how we cannot fall into that temptation of the contagious fear of, even though we're physically separated, can we still be united, and still come together? Yeah.
I think the thing that it causes me to think about is how sometimes in crises and situations like this, where we're doing everything we can to create an atmosphere of health, including lots of Purell.
Thank you, Adam. Timekeeper and Purell minister.
As we are doing this work with one another, that oftentimes there's a kind of hierarchy of who helps whom, and that when Jesus comes to the well and asks the Samaritan woman for help, I don't think my imagination is that she has not been in a position of being one to offer help. We were talking a little bit earlier this week that because she's at the well at high noon, we're pretty sure she's an outcast in her community. If she had come to the well in the morning with all the other women while it was still cool outside, we would have known she was part of a community. But in this instance, here's a woman who probably is scraping to get by, and here's this man, a Jew, outside of his own land and kind of, in some ways, in the land, a person of more privilege, asking her for some resource. And that kind of strikes me that it's inverting the situation. And then I wonder, in our own context, are there ways in which we need to empower people not only to receive help, but to offer it? And then also be vulnerable enough to ask, I'm thirsty. I need some help.
Excellent. Any last comments before we move to our next wondering?
I just think we need to think of practices. We need to think of practices. We need to be creative.
Yeah.
While being safe.
Right.
Creative in reaching out to one another and not allowing the language of us and them to be infected with fear.
Right.
Because of the social distances that we need to keep in order to be safe from the virus. Those two things are different.
Yeah.
We need to be inclusive and curious about how other people are doing in our world around us.
Right.
Even strangers.
Right.
So not
To
just
learn,
the people that we
yeah.
know, but reaching out to people. Maybe it's through social media, but just ask, how are you? How are you doing?
Yeah.
Just to and how are you thirsty?
Yeah. Right. Right. Absolutely. How can we learn from one another and still maintain that connectedness while we're separate?
So the second part that we have a wondering question about, when Jesus offers up that he is going to give her a drink of living water, this is the moment where I kind of imagine the Samaritan woman puts her hand on her hip and she stares at this foolish man who knows nothing about water. And she says, "Sir, you have no bucket, and the well is deep." And I don't know, if you've ever lived in a house that has well water, or been in a place where you rely on aquifers and well water. It is a limited resource.
Yeah.
And actually, what I was beginning to imagine as I was thinking about this little piece of the passage, if their ancestor Jacob first dug the well, and generations afterward have been having to dig deeper and deeper to keep the well replenished, that's probably a pretty deep well at this point. And if you don't have a tool like a bucket, how in the world are you going to bring up that water? So she has brought along the resource and the tool, and she's looking at this empty-handed guy who is claiming to have living water, and she doesn't see, what's your technique? How are you going to get down to the bottom of the well? And how are you going to draw it back up for any of us? And so in that exchange, the practicalities of how we share our gift or how we share living water is what strikes me. And I wonder, especially as we're entering into this time of pandemic, all the resources and vehicles that we usually use to share love are removed. No hugging, no touching, no drawing near to somebody who's in pain. If someone is weeping, stay 6 feet away and ask them politely how they're doing. And even more difficult, as we're isolating in our homes, we crossing that distance and that divide, I don't have a bucket, and the well is deep, and people are far away. And so I'm wondering, and I guess my wondering question is, what buckets do we have that we maybe can't see, or we haven't used them yet, tried them out, and how is it that we can employ those buckets to reach living water?
Listening to you talk about the depth of the well when we were chatting yesterday, I was imagining the depth of the well as like the depth of God's presence that is readily available to us. And yet, as I was listening to you, thinking about how they're there at high noon, so the community proper, so to speak, has already come and gotten a lot of water out of the well. They're going to have to go that much further. And it makes me think about the empty shelves in our stores that, where do you find things, pasta or peanut butter or toilet paper or whatever, cleaning supplies, things like that. And so it just, thank you for sharing that. It had a little bit of a different context because I do think that part of being in the midst of, not just entering, but like we're in the midst of this pandemic, is that to recognize that it's not just that spiritual thirst, but it's also the physical, just practical pieces of community life. And so what can we do safely for one another, and how can we be of assistance? Yeah, and part of it is not hoarding. Just throwing that out there.
When you started talking about the deep well, I was thinking about the Atlantic Ocean, because that's what separates me and Jeanette from Rosie, our daughter. She's in Switzerland right now, going to school. The school just closed, and transportation is not assured, right? Airplanes are not flying from as much, and so how do we stay in touch? We used WhatsApp this morning, and we were able to have a conversation with her. And then we established a regular time where we're going to check in and have that's our bucket right there, WhatsApp, which works really well. But there are, many different kinds of apps, and for some people it's about learning how to use a bucket that we've never had to use before.
Sure.
Like this, like how are we going to do worship with live streaming? We have luckily some experience with that, but for many people this is new.
Sure.
So we have to learn how to use buckets that we've never used before.
Yeah. And in that same line is the other buckets that, we're offering to the community, not only live stream for Sunday and Wednesday, and you'll get into this more later, but also taking advantage of Zoom to be able to have that group connection from a distance, FaceTime, Facebook Live, all sorts of other little buckets where we can draw some water, some spiritual centering, to call in for morning prayer, to have evening prayer on Facebook live stream. For all of these different ways, we are offering buckets to you all to draw a little bit of spiritual depth. I know we are over our time, definitely for that second question, so I will keep this last one short and sweet, hopefully. God help me. What I wanted to focus on really is that thirst, and not only what is the bucket or the tool that we will be going down into that deep well to grab, but I wonder what the living water is that we need to offer one another. Because it's easy in this particular setting to say the living water is the grace and the goodness of God, and that assurance that God is always abiding with us, right? Staying with us, dwelling with us. But even more so, what is that living water that we need? So my question is, I wonder what is the living water that will quench our thirst that we need to share right now? We were having a conversation yesterday, and I continue to ask people, what would be most helpful to you in this time? What's the living water that you need? I didn't phrase it that way because then people look at you funny. Right. No context.
Right. But I do think that people have repeatedly said to me, and I know in my own life it's true, I need some routine and I need community. And if I don't have routine, as nice as it is to sleep in or not have any schedule or what to do, I start to feel lost. I start to feel like I'm in the wilderness. I start to feel like I don't know what's happening next, and I need to locate myself, and I need to locate God, and I need to locate some other people. And so in this time, I think some of the living water I think I need is that routine and that practice that allows me to check in, or allows me to reach out and say, hey, not going so good over here, or could use some help. And that would allow me to feel that this time is not a wilderness where I don't know where we're going and when we'll get there and where's the rock that we need to strike to find some water, but rather, noon tomorrow, or 5:30 or 7:30 in the morning, that there's an opportunity awaiting me.
Yeah, I think that idea of stability is really important as a source of living water. And then I would add, sort of out of the Benedictine model of stability, obedience, and transformation, that we need to really listen to ourselves. We really need to listen to that voice, that inner voice in ourselves, get past all of the anxiety that we may be feeling, and really listening for what our heart is telling us is the most important thing to do. The most loving thing to do. Yeah. We're all navigating a new situation here. This is unprecedented. None of us have any experience really to draw on. So we have to be creative and we have to be patient. So I think that attitude of stability, of creating schedule and regularity in our lives as much as we can, and checking in with one another and then listening, will allow us to find that transformative piece that we need to live through and journey through this experience together, and find where God is leading us now, and recognize that God is here abiding with us at all times.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I think the living water for me is the space to be able to care for my family and create that level of stability. I recognize we're all in different phases, just all of us right here on the chancel, in different phases of life, and I'm sure you all are in your own different phase of life, and whether you have young kids that daycare is no longer available, or you have older kids that are in another country and that poses its own challenge, or spouses that are going through things, or kids that are school aged, and how do we provide some structure and some guidance and some assurance for them in this can be very anxious time, to be able to see, what does my family need? What do my kids need? And how can we help provide that for them while still staying connected and not, retreating to little bubbles. So, well, I didn't expect bubbles to be the final word of the sermon, but we hope that these questions and these wonderings are of a source of fruitfulness for you, and we encourage you. We will throughout the week provide opportunities to have Facebook conversations and such, or comment below the video. I don't know if that's available in our settings or not, but please share your wondering questions. Share what's on your heart, what you need, what you're doing to help during this time. We are to be a source for everyone. As you said, this is unprecedented. So together we move forward with God's presence. Amen. Thank you all for this conversation.